increase the talent, get really good developers, and get the money and invest in QA. The more QA you have, the better off you are. So the investment in security is kind of an interesting thing because of the incentives you see for that to happen. I scuba dive. And the first time I did scuba dive with somebody that I didn't know, the guy had a knife with him. And I always thought, what's the point of having a knife? Why do you need it? Are you going to chase a shark if you see with a knife? And then I asked the guy, why do you bring the knife? And the answer that I got was, well, if I really see a shark, I'm going to stab you and swim faster than you. Of course, this is a joke. It's actually to entangle lines, if you get into a line under the sea. But the point here is that the way the software industry works is kind of the same way. In other words, there's people bleeding out there, right? There's some companies that are not doing a good job. The other vendors, most of them, all they have to do is actually swim a little bit faster than the competition. So people will look and say, aha, I'm going to attack you, not you, right? Guess why, for example, there are a bunch of vulnerabilities in Adobe right now? Well, probably because Microsoft got their act together. Other companies such as Symantec, who has a big presence in the desktop, is also very focused on security because it's a security company. The next one that has a big presence in every single desktop is Adobe. Well, let's go to Adobe because, they're not looking at security until now, and now they're taking it very seriously. So moving on to adopters, the home users and the corporate users, they are also responsible for a lot of the vulnerabilities that you see out there. And here's how they are responsible. I'll give you two cars. They're pretty much the same car. One is a bug, it's blue, and it's reliable. The other one is convertible, has a rear spoiler, has alloy wheels, and it's red. Given you are a user, which one would you prefer? You see these two cars, think them as software, not cars. Which one would you go for? They cost the same price. The bottom line, the point I want to make with this slide is that users want features. That's what they want, that's what they see, right? Never mind that in order to do this car for the same price as this one, what's going to happen is you need more developers here because developers do features, not QA. So in order to put more developers, what you're going to do is create more code and probably less people to test it. And the more features you have, it's not a linear process. In other words, at some point you need also people to coordinate those features. So this car is not a little bit less reliable than that one. It's a lot less reliable than the second car. But people will look and say, well, I really want a convertible car. I mean, it's cooler, right? Never mind if later you're going to need a bunch of patches in order to make that car, as good as it was promised. So if users see the features like that, here's how they actually see security. Product A, product B. I cannot see any difference between the two, besides a really big price tag in product number one, right? The reliable product costs a lot more. But because you cannot see security, there's no way for users, they're not educated in security to notice the difference. They're going to look, scratch their heads and say, so why am I paying again for this first product? What it's giving me that I just cannot see? Users lack education, right? As Jeff Williams says, there's no nutrition facts for software yet. That's something that probably we should think about. How do we measure that a company is doing a good job in security? And I'll tell you, just looking by the number of vulnerabilities that a company had in the past is not a good indicator, because attackers really go against the companies that have the biggest market share. So those guys are the ones being hit harder, but doesn't mean their software is more vulnerable than the competitors who are just starting. Users want actually to use something that everyone uses, or sometimes they are just forced to. A lot of us use Windows, And sometimes it's not because we like Windows, but just because everyone uses Windows and creates a synergy. In order for a vendor to create the synergy, to be the market leader, they need to create a big ecosystem. And to create a big ecosystem, what you need is a lot of plugins. You need a lot of features. You need a lot of people building into your software, into your architecture, into your platform. The way you do it is you make really simple for everybody to actually create these new features to your platform. In simplicity and security sometimes are at odds. So you make really simple. People come and say, oh, I can build a plugin for your, your application, your website, whatever. And then the person goes and say, okay, I created this application, I created this plugin, but it's insecure. And later, security is built in. It's just a strategy, it's a market strategy in order to create this big ecosystem. I think this picture is classic. Who hasn't seen this kind of icon or this kind of message in a home user's desktop of people who are not computer savvy? My wife always have that thing up, right? New updates are waiting forever to take place. Whenever people don't do an update, they're responsible for the harm that that update is creating. And because my wife lives under the same roof that I do, and we share the same network, our network is going to suffer. In some countries, I believe here in Europe, actually there are some countries that just cut the internet access or have intention to cut the internet access of people who spread virus. Is this a good solution? Well, perhaps it is, perhaps it's not. We're going to talk a little bit more when we get to the government slides. But that's a very interesting idea, just cut access of people who are actually, spreading virus and worms on the internet. So after talking about home users, there's also the corporate users. And those guys are usually savvy about security and about software. So why they make bad decisions sometimes? Well, basically because there's a disconnect between the people who do the decisions and the people who actually use the software. Many of you who actually work for big companies know that sometimes you do your due diligence, you actually look at software, you choose the best one you could, and then you give a couple choices to management, and management goes with the second or third best choice in the list. And the reason is because of strategic partnerships, because of discounts, because of bundling of software. Whatever is the reason, there's a disconnect between the people who are going to actually suffer the pain of getting a software that is not the best one, and the business decision of getting one type of software or another. I'm pretty sure many of you heard sentences like, nobody ever got fired for buying IBM or for buying Cisco. As a manager, going with the market leader sometimes also means due diligence, right? Even if the software failed miserably in your environment, which is different from everybody else, what's going to happen is the manager can go and sit and say, well, I chose the best one in the market, and I did whatever I had to do, right? And that seems to be a good answer that people accept. The other thing about corporations is that just because we've been talking about software and the people who do software, there are other vectors of vulnerabilities. One of them is actually operations, right? Because of poor operations, Google had some problems in China because there were insiders who actually were giving information. Was one of the things that actually made part of the attack in China, right? Because of the configuration of environment in the United States, the TJ Maxx had a big problem with all the data that was in the, all the credit cards from their customers, right? So the harm and risk of software vulnerabilities is not only about having the software and being able to patch, but also how you handle your environment and also how you conduct your operations. There's also something that is quite funny about the way corporations handle vulnerabilities. If you look at this calendar, you have a floppy disk on Tuesday, the first Tuesday of a month. Anybody knows why? Microsoft Patch Tuesday. I think everyone heard about it, right? Every single first Tuesday of the month, Microsoft releases a bunch of, patches. It's a schedule thing. On the Wednesday, there's this call, and a lot of people call that Exploit Wednesday, because that's when all the bad guys look at the patches and start reverse engineering. So there's a lot of pressure to get this patch out as soon as possible. But that doesn't happen. And why it doesn't happen? Because availability for a corporation comes over any patch that you're going to actually deploy later. So in other words, if you deploy something here and it fails and puts all the machines in the corporation down, you're in trouble. So you actually have to do your due diligence as a IT person. So you cannot actually just deploy here. And by the way, Patch Tuesday is an invention from Microsoft, just because all the corporations came and said, we don't want patches all the time. We get overwhelmed with that. We really need a schedule, to do all the patches whenever, possible. So even corporations are looking at patches and saying, we just don't want a continuous stream of patches. That doesn't work for us. There is a problem. And there's also some other dates that you cannot deploy patches. The quarterly freeze, right at the bottom, right? The snowman. You cannot do that. One interesting thing about the slide is, consider now if you were a big manufacturer of software, a Oracle, Symantec, or somebody else. If you try to deploy software here in the same date that Microsoft does, all your updates, which kind of makes sense, right? Have all the updates deployed every the same day. The IT administrators would look at the updates and try to bundle all of them together. You would, probably get a problem, because people don't want to have all of those updates out at the same time. The same way, the media would say that the other company would be trying to hide behind Microsoft, because Microsoft has so many updates, they are so important that any other company would get under the radar. So really, the other companies only have the other days in order to deploy these patches. So you can see that it's very limited. Fridays and Mondays are also grayed out, because if you're running a large enterprise with presence in many countries, you have a problem. You cannot deploy here, otherwise you're going to have trouble. If there is any, and usually there is, a small percentage, but there is, you would have during the weekend, right, because of time differences. So those days also don't work for anybody. So security researchers, what do they do? Why they are responsible for the harm and risk of software vulnerabilities? Well, there's a big discussion here about full disclosure, responsible disclosure. I think most of you being in this conference probably already heard about the difference between one and another, right? Making a very short summary, the full disclosure usually, most of the times, gives all the details about the problem that was found. And most of the big viruses and worms that we've seen in the past came from a full disclosure. So it's a really hard thing to do, because whenever you have a full disclosure, you might be creating, a potential virus indirectly. If you do a responsible disclosure, you work with the vendor, the fix is going to be a little bit slower, but hopefully it's going to have more quality, because the vendor doesn't have the pressure of full disclosure in order to get things to, doesn't have to actually do the fix like running. Just today, a market for vulnerabilities. I found this very interesting, because now security is considered research, and people will pay for that. Companies like Tipping Point and iDefense will pay up to $40,000 for a good vulnerabilities, right? In the beginning, we'll look at this idea and there's nothing wrong with it, but there is actually a problem. The first one is actually, is this vulnerability going to be actually found or created? What I mean is that $40,000, if you look at how much it's worth in countries such as India or China, it's a lot of money. It's a lot of money in the US, it's a lot of money here as well. So if you work for a big company that does software, why don't you just create this vulnerability, right? Add to the software. You leave the company in 6 months,